Interestingly, our next stop is going back to Ravenna. At the time, culturally and economically fairly prosperous. It didn't have the same downfall that the rest of the Roman Empire did, mostly because it's a hill town, it's out of the way, and so we still see some wealth there. And San Vitale is built in honor of San Vitalis, who was martyred at the site in the 2nd century. It is a central plan structure with an octagonal structure beneath and that octagonal dome above, begun in 526 by Bishop Ecclesias to celebrate the reconquest, or really the coming to power of Justinian. And then in 540, Justinian will actually reconquer Ravenna, bringing this back into the Byzantine Empire. The outside is like a TARDIS. It doesn't look anything like the inside. The inside is richly appointed with marble and mosaics. And we have this incredible mosaic program, basically how the mosaics work together. Within the church, we see a blend of theological and political interests. In the apse, what you see in this incredible dome and everything is going to be Christ enthroned. And this is a different kind of image of Jesus. He's holding things that will indicate his role in power and in the church. He's giving a crown to Saint Vitalis, a crown of martyrdom. He's holding a scroll and he's sitting on an orb, the orb representing the earth. Again, people didn't think the earth was flat at really any point in history. Anyone who'd been out to sea knows that. And the Greeks had proven that it's round. And this is essentially a Greek culture. He holds the scrolls and he is surrounded by different figures. We see Ecclesias, the bishop, on the far right, holding a model of the church that he's offering to Jesus, very similar to what we saw from Guida and his plan for the temple back in the Sumerian Empire, or the Sumerian period in Mesopotamia. He's backed by archangels. So these are particularly important angels, typically Raphael, Michael, Gabriel, among others. And he's wearing violet again, this idea of him being the center. It's not a show of wealth. The gold showing his purity, divinity. The violet showing his role within the church. You'll notice the bishop is also wearing what appears to be violet. It could be brown. But again, getting at his role of power within the church. San Vitalis is receiving the crown of martyrdom, as I said, and then Ecclesias is offering the church to Jesus. Beneath him, you can see the 4 rivers down here flowing out. These were the 4 great rivers of the time. So showing basically Christ at the center of all that is Christianity. We also see the imperial panels, which are here below the image of Jesus in the apse. By the way, a note on the windows, you'll notice that many of them are, again, alabaster, although thin, so very similar to what we've seen in late antiquity. These traditions are carrying over. Glass is very expensive, very difficult to make at the time, especially clear glass in very flat panes. And this is symbolic of imperial authority in the absence of the emperor. Both became eternal participants in the Mass, the emperor and the empress. And they visually echo one another. And it should be pointed out that Justinian never comes to this church. He never comes to Ravenna. And yet he's there. It's no different than an image of a president in a classroom or in a school. Same idea. He is always present in that space. Now, the image of Justinian, we see him in the center, dressed in violet or purple once again, and he is processing through the nave into the church, or at least that's the imagery that we get. The figures include, for example, the one that is labeled, who is Maximanus, who was bishop in 546, which gives us an idea of when it was created. It's the only inscription. And that's because he's the person that we need a label for. All the others are attendants in various forms, so they aren't particularly important. When we look at the imagery, the bodies and heads are relatively proportional, but you'll notice things like the faces are very, very similar to one another, just like we saw in late antiquity. The feet are all identical. They're all sort of in that very odd form, but feet are very difficult because they require foreshortening. They require coming forward towards the viewer, and it's very difficult to do. The objects that are being carried, Justinian is carrying the bread for the Mass. This is the Eucharist. This is the bread that will become the body of Jesus in Christian tradition. And then we have others carrying, for example, a pot of incense and what we can presume to be a Bible or a book of Gospels being held. That's the gold book on the right over here. Here's our pot of incense. So we're seeing things that are highly symbolic. Effectively, what we're seeing is an image that tells us that Justinian makes the Eucharist possible in this area, that he is particularly pious and religious, and that he is key to the existence of this church. On the opposite side, we see an image of Theodora, and she is surrounded by women of the court. She's in the narthex, ready to ascend into the gallery, and it gives us a sense of how the church may have looked at the time. It also tells us about women's roles within the church. Women were segregated within the church space, in this case, being sent up to the second level, to the gallery. Why? Because the men below would not be forced to sin with their minds by looking upon the women if the men were above. And so by putting the women above, the men would have to make it quite obvious that they're looking up there, and they may not have been visible anyway. We also see the curtains and other elements here that give us a sense of how the church might have been decorated. These would be dropped down in front of the walls and create dead space between the fabric and the wall, thus creating effectively insulation. Not really effective insulation, but it was insulation for the time. We also get a sense of what the church may have looked like. The gold background giving us a sense that Theodora, just like Justinian, are in some ways divine. Not truly divine, but spiritual figures. On her dress, we see three magi, and they are right here, bringing gifts, just like she is bringing the gift of wine for the Eucharist, the wine that will become the blood of Christ during that Eucharistic miracle that we see in Christianity.